The sun burned like a merciless eye over the endless Arizona desert, casting long shadows across the red rocks and thorny cacti. Jack Sullivan wiped the sweat from his weathered face as he guided his horse through a narrow canyon. He had been riding alone for 3 days, searching for a lost silver mine that his grandfather had marked on an old, faded map. Jack was a man who preferred solitude. At 42 years old, he had spent most of his life wandering from town to town, never staying long enough to form lasting friendships. His beard was thick and gray-streaked, his hands calloused from years of hard work. People in the towns called him the Desert Rover because he always seemed to be moving, never settling down in one place. As his horse climbed over a rocky ridge, Jack heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. Voices carried on the desert wind, angry and harsh. He dismounted and crept forward, keeping low behind the boulders. What he saw in the valley below made his blood run cold. 3 Apache women were tied to wooden posts driven deep into the ground. Their clothes were torn and dusty, their faces streaked with tears and dirt. Around them stood a dozen white men, some wearing the blue uniforms of cavalry soldiers, others dressed like ranchers and traders. The men were shouting and arguing among themselves, but Jack could see they were preparing for something terrible. The oldest of the 3 women appeared to be about 30 years old. Her long black hair hung loose around her shoulders, and despite her desperate situation, she held her head high with fierce dignity. The other 2 were younger, probably her daughters. One looked to be about 16, the other maybe 14. All 3 had the same dark eyes that burned with defiance even in the face of death. A tall man with silver hair and an expensive suit stepped forward. Jack recognized him immediately, Colonel Marcus Webb, a wealthy rancher who owned thousands of acres near the town of Copper Ridge. Webb was known throughout the territory as a powerful man who always got what he wanted, no matter who got hurt in the process. "These Apache savages murdered my brother and his family," Webb declared to the other man. "They burned down his ranch and stole his cattle. Justice demands that they pay with their lives." One of the soldiers, a young sergeant with a nervous expression, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, shouldn't we take them back to town for a proper trial?" "The territorial judge could—" Webb's face twisted with anger. "There will be no trial, Sergeant. These animals don't deserve the courtesy of civilized justice. We found them with my brother's stolen property. That's evidence enough." Jack studied the scene more carefully. Something didn't feel right about Webb's story. The Apache women didn't look like raiders or killers. Their clothes were simple cotton dresses, not war paint and leather. They carried no weapons, and their hands were soft, not calloused from handling guns and knives. These were not warriors. They were just ordinary women, probably mothers and daughters trying to survive in an increasingly dangerous world. The older woman suddenly spoke, her voice clear and strong despite her fear. "We took nothing from any ranch. We were gathering medicine plants for our sick children when your men found us. We have done no harm to anyone." Webb backhanded her across the face so hard that her head snapped to the side. Blood trickled from her split lip. "Lying witch! My men found my brother's horse in your camp. You'll die for what you've done." Jack felt his anger rising. He had seen enough violence and injustice in his travels to recognize it when he saw it. These women were innocent, and Webb was using them as scapegoats for something else entirely. But what could one man do against 12 armed men in the middle of the desert? As he watched, Webb gave orders to his men to prepare the execution. Some gathered dry brush and wood for a fire, while others checked their rifles. Jack realized with growing horror that Webb intended to burn the women alive. This wasn't justice. It was murder disguised as revenge. The youngest girl began to cry, calling out in Apache for her mother. The older woman tried to comfort her, speaking in soft, soothing tones, even though she herself was facing death. Jack saw the love between them, the fierce protectiveness of a mother trying to shield her children from terror. It reminded him of his own mother, who had died protecting him from bandits when he was just a boy. Jack knew he couldn't stand by and watch innocent people die. But he also knew that charging into the valley with guns blazing would only get him killed along with the women. He needed a plan, something clever that would give them all a chance to escape. Looking around the rocky terrain, Jack spotted a narrow path that led down into the valley from the opposite side. If he could circle around without being seen, he might be able to reach the women while most of the men were distracted. But timing would be everything. Webb was giving a speech to his men about frontier justice and protecting white settlers from savage attacks. Jack used this distraction to lead his horse quietly along the ridge until he found the hidden path. He tied the animal to a sturdy mesquite bush and began making his way down on foot, moving from rock to rock like a shadow. The path was treacherous, covered with loose stones that could easily cause a landslide if he wasn't careful. Each step had to be planned and tested before he put his full weight down. Sweat poured down his face, but it wasn't just from the heat. One wrong move would alert Webb's men to his presence. As he got closer, Jack could hear more of the conversation. Webb was describing in gruesome detail how his brother had supposedly been tortured and killed. But Jack noticed something strange. Webb's story kept changing. First, he said his brother had been shot, then he claimed he'd been scalped, then he mentioned arrow wounds. Someone who had actually seen his dead brother would remember exactly how he died. Jack reached the bottom of the valley and crouched behind a large boulder about 50 yards from where the women were tied. From this angle, he could see their faces clearly. The older woman was watching Webb with intelligent eyes, as if she too had noticed the inconsistencies in his story. She was no fool. She understood that something deeper was happening here. Webb finished his speech and drew his pistol. "Any last words before you join your victims in hell?" The older woman lifted her chin and spoke in perfect English, surprising many of the men who had assumed she was just a simple savage. "I know who you really are, Colonel Webb, and I know what you did to your brother." Webb's face went pale. For a moment, his confident mask slipped, and Jack saw something like panic in his eyes. "What are you talking about? These are just the desperate lies of a condemned woman." "Your brother found out about the silver mine, didn't he?" the woman continued. "He discovered that you've been stealing from the Apache lands, digging up sacred ground and taking what doesn't belong to you. He threatened to expose you to the territorial government." Webb's hand trembled slightly as he pointed his gun at her. "You know nothing, squaw." "Nothing at all." But Jack could see that the woman had struck a nerve. Several of Webb's men were looking at their leader with new suspicion, wondering if there might be truth to her accusations. The young sergeant seemed especially troubled, his hand hovering uncertainly near his weapon. "So, you killed him," the woman pressed on. "You murdered your own brother to keep your secret safe. Then you burned down his ranch and blamed it on us. You needed scapegoats to cover up your crime." Webb's face turned red with fury. "Enough! I won't listen to any more lies from a murdering savage." He cocked his pistol and aimed it directly at her heart. Jack knew this was his moment. In a few seconds, it would be too late to save any of them. He had to act now, while Webb's attention was focused entirely on the woman. Taking a deep breath, he gripped his rifle tightly and prepared to make the most important decision of his life. The desert wind picked up, stirring dust devils across the valley floor. In the distance, a hawk circled overhead, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Jack stepped out from behind the boulder, his rifle raised and ready. The fate of 3 innocent women now rested in his hands. "Drop your weapons, all of you!" Jack's voice boomed across the desert valley like thunder. His rifle was trained on Colonel Webb, fingers steady on the trigger. The sudden appearance of the lone gunman shocked Webb's men into momentary silence. Webb spun around, his pistol still in his hand. "Who the hell are you? This is none of your business, stranger. Right away now, or you'll share their fate." Jack stepped closer, never lowering his rifle. "The name's Sullivan. And I'm making this my business. These women are innocent, and you know it. The young sergeant took a nervous step forward. Sir, maybe we should listen to what he has to say. Something about this whole situation doesn't feel right. Webb's eyes blazed with fury. Sergeant Morrison, you'll follow orders or face a court-martial. This drifter has no authority here. He gestured to his other men. Take him down. He's just one man against 12 of us. But Jack had positioned himself cleverly. With his back to a wall of solid rock, Webb's men couldn't surround him. They would have to come at him from the front, where his rifle could pick them off one by one. More importantly, Jack was standing directly between them and the 3 Apache women. Any wild shots meant to hit him might strike the prisoners instead. Before anyone starts shooting, Jack called out, maybe you should ask Colonel Webb to explain why his story about his brother's death keeps changing. First it was arrows, then bullets, then scalping. Which is it, Colonel? Several of Webb's men exchanged glances. Jack could see doubt creeping into their faces. These weren't hardened killers. Most were just ordinary soldiers and ranch hands following orders from a man they trusted. But trust could be shaken if enough questions were raised. Webb's face flushed red. Don't listen to this fool. He's probably working with the Apache, helping them raid our settlements. Jack laughed harshly. Do I look like I'm working with anyone? I've been riding alone for 3 days. Ask your men. They can see the dust patterns on my horse, the supplies in my pack. I'm just a prospector who happened to witness a murder about to take place. The oldest Apache woman spoke up again, her voice carrying clearly across the valley. Tell them about the silver mine, Colonel Webb. Tell them how you've been digging on sacred Apache burial grounds for months, stealing from the dead. Webb raised his pistol toward the woman. I warned you to keep your mouth shut. But Jack was faster. His rifle cracked like a whip, and Webb's pistol spun from his hand, shattered by the bullet. Webb screamed and clutched his injured wrist, blood seeping between his fingers. Next shot goes through your heart, Jack warned. Now start telling the truth or I'll let these women go and they can tell their story to the territorial authorities. Sergeant Morrison stepped forward, his own rifle now pointed at Webb instead of Jack. The young soldier's face was grim with understanding. Is it true, sir? Have you been mining on Apache lands without authorization? Webb tried to bluster his way out. Sergeant, I order you to arrest this man for interfering with military operations. But Morrison shook his head. This isn't a military operation, sir. We're not supposed to be executing prisoners without a trial. And if you've been lying about how your brother died... The sergeant's voice trailed off as the implication sank in. One of the ranch hands, an older man with gray whiskers, lowered his rifle completely. Colonel, I worked for your brother for 5 years. He was a good man, but he had a temper when it came to cheating and stealing. If he found out you were doing something illegal, he would have tried to stop you, another man finished. Maybe even threatened to report you to the territorial governor. Jack could see the tide turning. Webb's authority was crumbling as his men began to piece together the truth. But cornered animals were often the most dangerous, and Jack knew Webb wasn't finished yet. You fools! Webb snarled. Do you think a few Apache squaws are worth more than white settlers? Even if I did kill my brother, he was going to destroy everything we've built out here. The silver from that mine will make us all rich. The admission hung in the desert air like a death sentence. Several of Webb's men stepped back in horror, finally understanding that they had been following a murderer. Sergeant Morrison looked sick to his stomach. My God, Morrison whispered. You actually killed your own brother. Webb pulled a hidden derringer from his vest with his uninjured hand. And I'll kill anyone else who gets in my way. He spun toward the Apache women, intending to shoot them before anyone could stop him. Jack was already moving. He dove forward, tackling Webb around the waist and driving him to the ground. The derringer fired harmlessly into the air as the 2 men rolled in the dust, fighting for control of the weapon. Webb was smaller than Jack, but desperate. fighting with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. He clawed at Jack's eyes and tried to bite his throat. Jack's hat fell off, and his long hair whipped around his face as they struggled. The Apache women watched tensely as their fate was decided by the two fighting men. The younger girls had stopped crying, their attention fixed on the life-and-death struggle taking place just yards away from them. Jack managed to pin Webb's gun hand to the ground, but the colonel drove his knee up into Jack's ribs, knocking the wind from his lungs. Webb twisted free and scrambled toward his shattered pistol, hoping to find a piece large enough to use as a weapon. Sergeant Morrison had his rifle trained on the fighting men, but couldn't get a clear shot without risking hitting Jack. The other soldiers stood frozen, unsure whether to help their former leader or the stranger who had exposed his crimes. Webb's fingers closed around a jagged piece of his broken pistol. He raised it high above his head, aiming for Jack's exposed back. Sunlight glinted off the sharp metal as it began to descend. The crack of a rifle echoed across the valley. Webb stiffened, the makeshift weapon falling from his nerveless fingers. A red stain spread across his shirt as he toppled forward into the dust, dead before he hit the ground. Jack rolled away from the corpse and looked up to see Sergeant Morrison lowering his smoking rifle. The young soldier's face was pale but determined. "He was a murderer and a thief," Morrison said simply. "Justice had to be done." Jack nodded his thanks and got to his feet, dusting off his clothes. His ribs ached where Webb had kneed him, but he was essentially unharmed. He walked over to where the three Apache women were still tied to their posts. "Let's get you ladies free," he said, pulling out his knife to cut their ropes. As the bonds fell away, the oldest woman rubbed her wrists and studied Jack's face. "Why did you help us? You could have ridden away and avoided all this trouble." Jack considered the question as he helped the younger women to their feet. "I guess I've seen too much injustice in my travels. Sometimes a man has to take a stand, even when it's dangerous." The woman nodded slowly. "In Apache, we have a saying, 'The heart that helps strangers will never walk alone.' You have shown great courage today, Jack Sullivan." Jack was surprised that she knew his name, then remembered he had announced it during the confrontation. "What's your name, ma'am?" "I am Maria Delgado. These are my daughters, Elena and Rosa." She gestured to the younger women. "We are not full Apache. My husband was Mexican, which is why I speak English well. We live peacefully with my mother's people, gathering herbs and caring for the sick." Sergeant Morrison approached them, his expression respectful. "Ladies, I apologize for what happened here today. Colonel Webb lied to us about what you had done. We had no idea we were being used to cover up his crimes." Maria studied the young soldier's face and seemed to find sincerity there. "You chose to do what was right when it mattered most. That takes honor." Jack looked around at the remaining men, who were standing in uncomfortable silence. "What happens now, Sergeant?" Morrison straightened his shoulders. "Now I report back to Fort Apache with the truth about what happened here. Colonel Webb's illegal mining operation will be shut down, and the Apache lands will be protected. These ladies will be escorted safely back to their people." One of the ranch hands stepped forward nervously. "What about us? We didn't know Webb was a murderer when we rode out here." "You'll all need to give statements about what you witnessed," Morrison replied. "But as long as you tell the truth about Webb's confession, you shouldn't face any charges. You were following orders from a superior officer." Jack gathered up his hat and rifle, preparing to leave. His work here was done, and the desert was calling him back to its solitude. But as he started toward his horse, Maria called out to him. "Jack Sullivan, where will you go now?" He paused, looking back at the woman who had shown such courage in the face of death. "Wherever the road takes me, I suppose. I'm not much for staying in one place." Maria smiled, and for the first time since he had found her tied to that post, she looked truly peaceful. "The Apache have many sacred places in these lands. If you ever need shelter or food during your travels, mention my name to any of my people. They will remember what you did here today." Jack touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "I appreciate that, ma'am. Take care of those daughters of yours." As he rode away up the rocky path, Jack could hear Sergeant Morrison organizing his men for the journey back to Fort Apache. The three women would be safe now, and Webb's crimes would be exposed to the territorial authorities. Justice had been served, even though it had cost a man his life. The sun was beginning to set behind the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Jack settled into his saddle and let his horse pick its own pace through the cooling evening air. Tomorrow he would continue his search for the lost silver mine, but tonight he could rest easy knowing he had done the right thing. Behind him, smoke from Webb's funeral pyre rose into the darkening sky, carrying away the last evidence of a man who had let greed and violence corrupt his soul. 3 weeks later, Jack Sullivan sat in the dusty saloon of Copper Ridge, nursing a warm beer and listening to the conversations around him. News traveled slowly in the desert, but when it finally arrived, it often brought surprising revelations with it. The bartender, a heavy-set man named Pete, with permanent sweat stains under his arms, was holding court with several local ranchers. "I tell you, nobody saw it coming. Colonel Webb, a murderer. His own brother, no less. Makes a man wonder who else around here might be hiding dark secrets." One of the ranchers, a thin man with a drooping mustache, shook his head in disbelief. "My wife worked for the Webb family for years. She always said there was something cold about Marcus, but fratricide? That's beyond anything she imagined." Jack kept his head down and his mouth shut. Word had spread about the confrontation in the desert, but most people didn't know the identity of the mysterious stranger who had intervened. Jack preferred it that way. Fame and attention had a way of complicating a man's life, and he valued his anonymity too much to give it up for a few free drinks and backslaps. The saloon doors swung open, and Sergeant Morrison walked in wearing civilian clothes. His military service had ended abruptly after he filed his report about Webb's crimes, but from what Jack had heard around town, the young man was doing well as a deputy sheriff. Morrison's eyes swept the room and settled on Jack's familiar figure in the corner. "Mind if I join you?" Morrison asked, pulling out a chair without waiting for an answer. Jack gestured to the empty seat. "Free country, last I heard, though that might change depending on who gets elected next." Morrison signaled Pete for a beer and settled back in his chair. "I thought you might like to know how things turned out. The territorial investigators finished their work on Webb's operation yesterday." "Find anything interesting?" Jack asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "More than we bargained for. Webb had been stealing silver from Apache burial sites for over 2 years. He used his position and connections to falsify mining claims and bribe local officials. The operation was worth nearly $50,000. Jack let out a low whistle. That was enough money to buy half the town. No wonder Webb had been willing to kill his own brother to protect it. Morrison continued. They also found evidence that Webb murdered 2 Apache men who discovered his operation last spring. Made it look like they died in a hunting accident. Your friends Maria and her daughters weren't his first victims, just the ones he got caught trying to silence. The news didn't surprise Jack, but it still made him angry. Webb had been a predator hiding behind a uniform and a respectable reputation, destroying lives to feed his greed. At least now his crimes were exposed for all to see. "What happened to the silver?" Jack asked. "Returned to the Apache Nation, along with formal apologies from the territorial government. They're using it to build a school and a medical clinic for their people. Maria Delgado is going to teach there. Turns out she learned reading and writing from missionary teachers when she was younger." Jack smiled slightly at that news. Maria had impressed him with her intelligence and courage during their brief encounter. It was good to know she would be using those qualities to help her people build a better future. Morrison took a long drink of his beer and studied Jack's face. "There's something else you should know. The Apache Council voted to grant you honorary status as a friend of their people. It's a rare honor for an outsider." "Don't need any honors," Jack replied. "Just did what needed doing." "Maybe so, but they want to do something for you anyway. Maria left a message saying you're welcome on Apache lands anytime. And they've offered to guide you to some of the old Spanish treasure sites in the mountains. Apparently, there are silver mines up there that make Webb's operation look like pocket change." Jack considered this offer. He had been searching for his grandfather's lost mine for months without success. Maybe it was time to try a different approach, with guides who actually knew the land and its history. The saloon doors opened again, and a well-dressed man in an expensive suit entered. Jack recognized him as Judge Harrison, the territorial magistrate who had been investigating Webb's crimes. The judge looked around the room until his eyes settled on Jack and Morrison. "Gentlemen," Judge Harrison said, approaching their table, "I wonder if I might have a word with you both." Morrison stood respectfully, but Jack remained seated. He had learned long ago that judges and lawyers rarely brought good news to men like him. Harrison pulled out a chair and sat down without invitation. "Mr. Sullivan, I've been looking for you. The territorial government wants to offer you a position as a federal marshal. Your actions in the Webb case demonstrate exactly the kind of integrity and courage we need in our law enforcement officers." Jack nearly choked on his beer. "Marshal? You've got the wrong man, Judge. I'm a drifter, not a badge-wearing lawman." "Perhaps that's exactly why you'd be good at it," Harrison replied. "You don't have political connections or personal interests that could compromise your judgment. You saw injustice and stopped it, regardless of the personal cost. That's what we need more of out here." Jack shook his head firmly. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not cut out for that kind of work. I prefer to handle problems as they come, not go looking for them." Harrison looked disappointed but not entirely surprised. "Well, if you change your mind, the offer will remain open. In the meantime, there's a reward for exposing Webb's crimes. $500, courtesy of the Territorial Treasury." Before Jack could protest, Harrison placed a leather pouch on the table. The coins inside clinked softly against each other. "Consider it payment for services rendered to the people of Arizona Territory." Jack stared at the money. $500 was more than most men made in a year of hard work. It would buy him supplies for months of prospecting, or a good horse, or passage to California if he decided to try his luck in the gold fields there. "There's one more thing," Harrison added. "Webb's ranch is going up for auction next week. The territorial government is selling it to compensate his victims and pay his debts. If you're interested in settling down, it might be worth considering. Good water rights and plenty of grazing land." Jack picked up the money pouch and hefted its weight. "What would a man like me do with a ranch? I don't know anything about raising cattle or farming." Morrison leaned forward. "You could learn. Maria Delgado mentioned that her people would be willing to help you get started in gratitude for what you did. They know this land better than anyone." For a moment, Jack allowed himself to imagine it. A permanent home, neighbors who respected him, work that didn't require constantly moving from place to place. It was an appealing fantasy. But he wasn't sure he was ready for that kind of responsibility. Judge Harrison stood up and adjusted his suit jacket. "Think about it, Mr. Sullivan. Sometimes a man's greatest adventures come from putting down roots instead of running from them." After the judge left, Jack and Morrison sat in comfortable silence for a while. The saloon was filling up with evening customers, ranch hands and miners looking to wash away the dust and weariness of another hard day. "You going to take him up on any of those offers?" Morrison asked eventually. Jack turned the money pouch over in his hands. "The marshal job? No chance. But the ranch?" He paused, staring out the window at the desert landscape that had been his home for so many years. "I don't know. Maybe it's time to try something different." Morrison smiled. "For what it's worth, I think you'd make a good neighbor. This country needs more men who are willing to stand up for what's right." 3 days later, Jack found himself riding toward the Apache settlement where Maria and her daughters lived. The money from Judge Harrison was tucked safely in his saddlebags, along with supplies for a longer journey than usual. He had decided to take Maria up on her offer to show him the old Spanish mines, and maybe to explore the possibility of staying in one place for a while. The Apache village was larger than he had expected, with several dozen families living in a mixture of traditional homes and newer buildings influenced by Mexican and American styles. Children played in the dusty streets, while women worked at cooking fires and men tended horses in wooden corrals. Maria emerged from one of the buildings as soon as she spotted Jack's approach. She looked healthier than when he had last seen her, with bright eyes and a genuine smile that transformed her entire face. "Jack Sullivan," she called out. "Welcome to our home." Jack dismounted and tied his horse to a hitching post. "Maria, good to see you again. How are Elena and Rosa?" "They are well. Elena has decided to become a teacher like me, and Rosa wants to learn medicine from the tribal healers. They speak of you often, calling you the man who gave them back their futures." Jack felt embarrassed by the praise. "I just did what anyone would do in the same situation." Maria laughed softly. "No, my friend. Not anyone would have risked their life for 3 strangers. You have a good heart, whether you admit it or not." She led him through the village, introducing him to various families and explaining the community's way of life. Jack was surprised by how welcoming everyone was, treating him not as an outsider, but as an honored guest. Word of his actions had spread throughout the Apache nation, earning him respect and gratitude wherever he went. That evening, as they sat around a cooking fire sharing a meal of roasted rabbit and cornbread, Maria told him more about the Spanish treasure sites in the mountains. "My grandmother's grandmother remembered when the Spanish priests buried silver and gold to hide it from Mexican revolutionaries," she said. "Some of it was recovered years later, but much remains hidden. The locations were passed down through songs and stories, but many of the landmarks have changed over time." Jack leaned forward, interested despite himself. "Your people would really be willing to help me search for these places?" "Of course. You saved our lives and exposed the man who was desecrating our sacred sites. Helping you find honest treasure is a small thing compared to what you did for us." Jack looked around at the faces gathered around the fire. Men, women, and children who had accepted him as family despite knowing him for only a few hours. It was a new experience for a man who had spent most of his adult life as a solitary wanderer. "There's something else I need to tell you," Jack said. "Judge Harrison offered me the chance to buy Webb's ranch. I'm thinking about it." Maria's eyes lit up with excitement. "That would be wonderful. The ranch borders our lands, and Webb always kept us away with threats and violence. A friendly neighbor would be a blessing." As the fire burned down to glowing embers, Jack found himself making a decision that would change the course of his life. The desert would always be part of him, but maybe it was time to stop running from human connection and start building something lasting. The next morning, he would begin his search for Spanish treasure with Apache guides who knew every secret of the ancient mountains. But more than that, he would begin the journey toward becoming a member of a community, a man with roots and responsibilities and people who counted on him. The lonely desert rover was finally ready to come home.